phenomenology there. And now I'll leave the floor to you, Javi. We're running a little bit late, so we'll probably, it's over here now, it's 20 to 4. So we'll finish around 5 hour time. I'm not sure if you can all figure out when that is exactly for yourselves. So the floor is yours, Javi.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, and sorry I can't be there in person. I'm sure the people who are in Cyprus are having a great time here. It's a bit drizzly, you know, it's the UK. So yeah, thank you very much, and thank you to Christos for all the toing and froing and organizing of the conference, and of the various time zones and so on. So I will try and share my screen, and then we'll be, yeah, good. So can you see this okay? Okay, I'll just give it a second because my screen's gone blank. It's thinking about it. Here we go. Okay,
it shows up fine on our end.
It looks okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so I think a very profound bodily function, and something that is a lot more than a bodily function, and I will talk about today is breathing and its pathological counterpart, which is breathlessness. And what I will try and do in the time allotted is to really talk about what a phenomenology of breathing and breathlessness would look like. And what I primarily want to flag up is, of course, the relationship or the significance, the foundational status of breathing and the control of breathing, the mindful control of breathing in all mindfulness practices I'm aware of. So it could be pranayama breathing, it could be mindful breathing, it could be in particular types of yoga breathing that is coordinated with a particular asana or particular movement, and the same in other non-spiritual activities. For example, in Pilates and of course in all sports, the coordination of one's breath and the awareness of one's breath are absolutely key to any kind of physical activity. So we have this significance of breathing spreading across spiritual practices, mindful practices, but also physical practices. And of course, that pretty much covers everything that we do. So the breath is something that is everywhere. It is something that accompanies every activity we do. Again, be that a physical or somatic or a mental or a psychic activity. And of course, the combination of these. But paradoxically, we pay very little attention to our breath, at least insofar as it functions properly. So this is a general truism of sorts that we can criticize and talk about, but I want to start out with just saying it is a general truism in the phenomenology of health and illness that following say, people like Sartre, who of course talked about the transparency of the body in health, breathing and is something that is transparent, as in it accompanies our activities, it accompanies our actions as a sort of silent enabler. And insofar as we are happy breathers, we are not particularly aware breathers. We become aware breathers in one of two types of situations. The first is what I mentioned, people who become aware breathers through a particular practice, be that a spiritual practice or a physical practice like sports. And again, I'm not trying to create a dichotomy here. I'm just pointing to the kind of spectrum of activities. If you're a runner, you might want to coordinate your breathing with your steps in a particular way. And of course, if you're a meditator, you will do other things with your breath. But that doesn't mean that when you meditate, you don't have a body, or that when you run, you don't have a mind. I'm not saying that at all. So breath is everywhere, but it's also invisible. And what makes it visible is the times when we turn our mindful attention to it, whether for practical reasons, say if we're doing sports, or if we're learning a particular type of pranayama breathing or meditation. And of course, when it goes wrong, when it limits or inhibits our activity. Now, the bulk of my work has been on the latter kind of attention, which is negative attention, a sad attention, an attention that occludes or prevents us from thinking about the activity we're trying to perform. And of course, in situations where our very existence, our very life is challenged, our every capacity to breathe is challenged. And again, I'm talking about a huge range of practices. There are people who are professional sort of breath holders, who they're called free divers, and the point of their activity is to stay underwater for as long as possible, and they can hold their breath for, you know, phenomenal amounts of time. Well, the reports vary, but I think definitely over 12 minutes of breath holding that free divers are able to do. And there are other kind of liminal situations where the lack of breath becomes a very pressing concern. And we can think here about you know, the most extreme forms of human encounters, the use of suffocation and things like waterboarding in torture. So one very, very effective way to torture somebody is by toying with their breath, restricting it in some kind of way. In cases of domestic abuse, usually but not exclusively of women by men, the use of strangulation is often a very prominent feature of the physical and psychological violence inflicted on the person. And strangulation is also used in cases of both torture and domestic violence to convey a very strong message to the person, which is, I control your life. I will dictate to you whether you live or die. And the thing about breathing and breathlessness, of course, is that they are connected to our very sense of existence, or to our very most innermost and atavistic sense of just being alive. And I think if you just think of the situation, if somebody were to put a pillow or hand to your mouth and nose and prevent you from breathing, within seconds, that would become, you know, your primary struggle for life, your primary concern. Okay? So breathing is everywhere. And as we can see, when we start looking at the kinds of practices, for better and of course for very, very worse, in which breath is manipulated, we can see the extent to which it is our fundamental sense of being alive that is intimately tied to breathing and its absence. So when somebody is breathless, it's not like somebody who has a limp, or somebody who has diabetes, or somebody who has early stages of dementia. It is a threatening, it is an immediate and profound threat to one's very existence. And that's why breathing and its pathological counterpart, breathlessness, should be at the forefront of medical research. They haven't been at the forefront of medical research, although recently, with the advent of COVID-19, of course, there has been a much growing interest in breathing and breathlessness. In particular, because what became apparent, I think, to the general public consciousness is that the term breathlessness doesn't denote a monolithic or singular biological state, but is a complex outcome of physiological, psychological, cognitive, and emotional factors that all come together to create the sensation that we call breathlessness, which is much more complex than I think we would normally imagine. Okay, so what I want to try and do in this talk is to give you the bare backbones of what a phenomenology of breathing and breathlessness would look like. And luckily, because this is a conference about phenomenology, I'll be able to move forward quite quickly with this in order to really articulate all of these insights about breathing, its control, its modulation, and its absence, or its troubled form in the form of breathlessness, that can then be tied into, I think, a lot of the conversations around mindfulness and phenomenology that will take place in the conference. Okay, so I'll just quickly say that I was lucky to get funding from the Wellcome Trust in the UK to do a project called The Life of Breath, which really explored breathing and breathlessness in an attempt to take breathlessness from being seen as a physiological pathology or as a medical symptom to understanding it in much broader terms. So we wanted to take humanities approaches like philosophy, medical anthropology, medical history, literature, and to use those to try and understand breathlessness in order to take that concept away from the clinic, or to take it beyond the clinic rather, and think about breathlessness as a phenomenon that can only be understood if we have an understanding of the emotional, psychological, spiritual, and even social significance of breathing. And I will say something about that, breathing as a political concept, if you like, in a minute. So again, breathing is not like kidney function or blood sugar levels. It's a unique bodily function. It's physiologically unique because it's unconsciously regulated, but we have this conscious override. We don't have this conscious override for our, again, our kidney function or our pancreas or many, if not most of our bodily functions. But this dual role, the fact that it's unconsciously regulated, so it usually takes care of itself, but that we can consciously override it, right? We can decide to hold our breath up to a certain point. We can decide to slow down our breath or to speed it up. We can decide to hyperventilate. We have a lot of capacity to override this unconsciously regulated mechanism. But of course, when we sleep or even when we are unconscious, we carry on breathing. And that's because it is unconsciously regulated. So it's a funny physiological function that straddles both conscious and unconscious regulation. And the other sense in which breathing is so unique as a bodily function is because of this very powerful connection to our well-being and our emotional state. So when we get startled, we draw breath. When we feel upset or stressed or panicky, our breathing becomes shallow and rapid. And so our emotional state, to an extent, modulates our breathing. And of course, our ability to modulate our breathing also affects our emotional state. So if we want to calm ourselves down, we can consciously slow down our breathing, consciously slow down our speech. If we want to create a particular atmosphere of relaxation, we might slow down our breathing and try and divide it into portions, the way you do in Ujjayi breathing, for example. And also, we can try and use breathing in other ways. So I'm not sure if this practice has a name, but there's people who meet together to laugh as a form of, I guess, a well-being exercise of sorts. I don't know if anybody in the conference knows more about it than me. I know very little about it, except that, people come together to laugh, and I guess the stated outcome is that it's meant to make them feel better. And part of what you do when you laugh is you aerate the lungs, have a bigger and quicker gas exchange. And of course, that is one way to wake ourselves up, for example, is by taking a deep breath and punctuating the shallow or regular breathing that we were engaged in by taking a deeper breath. So we have this two-way connection between breath and emotional state. We can impact on the emotional state by consciously changing our breathing, and we can impact our breathing with changes to our mood and emotional state. But more broadly, breathing, again, unlike kidney function, has a cultural, psychological, and spiritual significance. The cultural significance, of course, will vary from one culture to another. We have, in the history of Christianity, lots of talk about the Holy Spirit, the divine breath. We have the psychological connection that I just spoke about. And of course, the spiritual significance, often associated with cleansing, with a fresh start, with, replacing this stale air with fresh air and so on. Now, the important thing here, I think there's two things. One, the extent to which the breathing, and in particular the lungs, are also a unique bodily organ because it's the one that is engaged in a constant exchange with the outside world. So when you look at something like organ transplantation, the reason why lung transplants are less successful than kidneys and hearts and other organs is because the lungs are exposed. They're constantly being exposed to external air and to the pathogens that the air carries. But COVID-19 is of course the one that'll be at the forefront of our minds. So it is also the part of the body that is in constant contact with the external world, with the outside air. And when I said earlier that breathing is also political, we can think about air pollution as an extremely significant, but again, very invisible and sadly underappreciated part of the politics of climate change. The air that we breathe is being polluted by industry, factories, road traffic, and so on. And that in itself means that breathing isn't just something I do with myself. Breathing is always something I do with other people. Breathing is always something for which I depend on other people. So when we breathe, we also co-breathe, if you like. When we breathe, we're breathing with other people, and we're breathing what other people. For example, the people who who own fossil fuel companies make us breathe. That includes a huge number of sources of of air pollution, which is a growing problem across the globe. Again, not as visible maybe as other types of pollution, but very much there. And one more sense in which breathing is political is if we think about the US slogan, "I can't breathe," following the death through police brutality of people who were who were restrained by being put on their stomachs with their hands behind their back and with pressure applied to the back of their neck. There were quite a few cases in recent years in the US, possibly elsewhere, where people who were held in that particular restraining position said, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe," and ended up dying of suffocation. So "I can't breathe" has also become a political slogan used to express the plight of the disenfranchised, those who were the victims of police brutality, of police racism often. And of course, this call, "I can't breathe," was intimately tied with some of the Black Lives Matter movement. So Again, it's not just something I do with myself, it's something we always do with other people, whether we want to or not. We are dependent on others for our breath. And what we breathe is also the outcome of particular social arrangements. So our ability to breathe and our inability to breathe are intimately tied to political factors such as police brutality, air pollution, and so on. Okay, now I think there is, as I said, a profound difference between breathing, which I've spoken about until now, and pathological breathing, which is breathlessness. I think they are on a continuum. You can start out breathing fine, develop something like COPD and gradually become more breathless. But there will be a point where rather than the breathless being some sort of factor in the background of your everyday routine, habitual body and habitual life, it will simply take over and become a dictating factor. And it is at that point that I identify the transition from normal breathing to pathological breathing. That's the point at which it becomes pathological. And what is pathological breathing? What is this breathlessness? It is a situation where we can easily contrast the tacit, transparent, in the background, taken for granted type of breathing we normally do. And again, even when you're exerting yourself as a healthy person, that exertion is contained within an experience of the everyday. It's not experienced as threatening. It's not experienced as life-limiting. It's not experienced as something that dictates to you what you do. So when you're doing sports, even extreme sports, you're pushing your boundary from the inside, as it were. You're pushing yourself to work harder, run faster, lift heavier weights, cycle quicker, whatever. But you're doing that from within the familiarity of an everyday type of embodiment that is familiar, that feels comfortable, that feels safe. So normal breathlessness doesn't feel threatening. Normal breathlessness doesn't feel limiting. Pathological breathlessness takes you outside of your familiar engagement with the geography of the world, with your own body, with your project, and one that becomes the dictating factor in a particular situation. So contrast two scenarios. The first scenario, you're going for a walk after dinner. You say to your friend, do you want to go for a stroll? We're in beautiful Cyprus. Let's walk along the coast. And after dinner, you go for a walk. And you walk, say, for 40 minutes. And then you decide to turn around and come back. What you have here is an experience of freedom. You chose to go for a walk. You chose to go along the coastal path. You chose to walk for 40 minutes and then turn back. You could have gone on for longer. You weren't limited in your project. You weren't limited in your activity. Now contrast that with pathological breathlessness. You want to go for a walk after dinner. Where you walk, the gradient, the type of terrain you're walking on, the distance you can walk, maybe if you're using oxygen, how much oxygen you're taking with you. These all have to be pre-decided, and they are the ones that dictate to you where you will go, if you will go, how far you will go, who you'll go with. Maybe you need somebody to carry your oxygen. Maybe you need to be sure that there's a resting point at the 50% mark. Maybe you need to keep checking your oxygen to make sure you're not running out, that you've got enough to come back. That type of project, right? So in both cases, you're going for a stroll after dinner. The first one is a project of freedom. The second one is a project of limitation, because it's entirely dictated and prescribed by the kinds of considerations you have to make when you are pathologically breathless. So that's the contrast I want to draw between the healthy, I'm just going for a stroll, and the pathological, I will go for a stroll, but it's all got to be carefully calculated and prescribed. And I can't veer from my plan. I can't change my plan. I lose my spontaneity. to a large extent. That's the contrast. Freedom, security, familiarity, and safety, contrasted with unfamiliarity, uncanniness, limitation, and an explicit consideration that has to be given. So breathlessness, of course, is a symptom in a wide range of diseases: respiratory, cardiac, and sometimes psychiatric, for example, in cases of panic disorders. And of course, it's a symptom rather than a disease that features in a lot of different diseases. Now, going back to what I said earlier, it's not a simple bodily sensation. So there's a group called Breathe Oxford, and they do research on what they call the neuroscience of breathlessness. They're trying to figure out what happens in the brain of the breathless person when they become breathless, and what happens in the brain of a healthy person, physically healthy person, when they experience breathlessness. And what they have discovered, one of the many things they have discovered, is that it is a complex sensation that is locked in a kind of feedback loop and is very much informed by prior experiences of breathlessness. So this pathological breathlessness I was just talking about isn't just a de novo experience we have each and every time anew, but is an experience that becomes worse and worse, I'll explain why in a minute, over time, after repeated experiences of breathlessness in situations of discomfort. For example, being breathless in public, for example, wanting to run for a bus and not being able to do that, feeling like you're going to faint in the middle of the street, being very anxious about drawing attention to yourself as a breathless person, being scared that people will attribute to you stigmas such as being a smoker, or being unfit, or being overweight, or somebody who doesn't exercise enough. So a lot of negative cognitive information attaches itself to experiences of breathlessness, and then these become exacerbated over time by repeated experiences of discomfort, of uncanniness, of a sense of being unsafe when one experiences breathlessness. In particular, outside, in public, in front of other people, when you're trying to achieve something like catching a particular train on a particular time. And the result that we often see in people with respiratory illness is a narrowing of the world as they start going out less and less, exercising less and less, pushing themselves less and less. And ultimately, this vicious cycle ends up in physical deconditioning, when people don't want to put themselves in those unpleasant situations. Now, I said that this is a feedback loop. And one thing that we find in the physiology of breathlessness is something called interreceptive hypervigilance. And what happens in interreceptive hypervigilance is that a relatively low-key, benign sensation of breathlessness becomes amplified by the brain, because the brain is hypervigilant to these particular types of input from the body, this constant interoception that we do, the scanning of the body. How breathless am I? Are other people noticing me? Is somebody going to think I'm about to pass out? Am I about to pass out? Do I need to sit down? Have I got enough oxygen to get me to wherever it is that I'm going? So these kinds of thoughts, they can be conscious. There can also be sort of unconscious information in this feedback loop. And what happens is that the experiences of breathlessness become experienced as subjectively worse and worse because of this hypervigilance. So signals from the brain that would normally not be taken much notice of become amplified a lot, and the sensation of breathlessness becomes worse, or experienced as worse, by the person who is chronically breathless. So it's not a simple bodily sensation. First, because it is made up of a lot of different bodily factors. It's the rate of breathing, There's a lot of information coming from the diaphragm. There's information coming from blood pH levels, which is related to the amount of CO2 you have in your blood. It comes from information from the muscles involved in respiration. It comes, of course, from our emotional state and from our cognition. So the thoughts we have about our breathlessness can make our sensation of breathlessness much worse than it is. So it's not a simple bodily sensation, because first we get a lot of information from the body that we synthesize into something, our brain synthesizes into something that we use the word breathlessness to describe, but it's a very complex something. And secondly, because repeat experiences, reiterations of breathlessness experiences change the quality and the severity of those experiences to make the experience of breathlessness ultimately experiences subjectively much worse when you're 15 years into your COPD than when you're just a new patient. So the experience of breathlessness is shaped by our past experiences, by the expectations. So one thing Pattinson and his group do is they show people lying in a brain scanner, a functional MRI scanner. They show them pictures, for example, of a staircase, and you see in the brain of breathless, of chronically or pathologically breathless people, that the mere image of a staircase will cause them a feeling of breathlessness, even though they're not actually doing anything in their bodies. They're not actually climbing the stairs. A person without respiratory condition won't have this type of reaction. So we can see that the breathlessness starts with an expectation, with a set of beliefs about what I can and can't do, and with these complex sensations coming from different parts of the body I was just describing. Okay, so what do we have here? We have something that is known in respiratory medicine as the discrepancy between objective and subjective measurements of breathing. Now, of course, there is no objective measurement of breathlessness. The only way you can ascertain how breathless somebody is by asking them to rank their breathlessness on a breathlessness measurement scale. What you can measure objectively is lung function. So you can measure people's total lung volume, the residual volume, the FEV1, which is a significant measurement of how much air you can exhale in 1 second, the total lung capacity, the gas exchange rate, various ratios within that. So we can do very, very intricate and very precise objective measurements of our lung function. And we can ask people to say how breathless they feel subjectively. But we don't have an objective measurement of breathlessness, and we don't have a subjective measurement of our actual lung function. So there is this discrepancy in which patients very routinely either over or underperform. So patients with very poor lung function can be actually very active. They can have a family, go to work, travel, do all sorts of stuff that you might say, oh, how could they do that when their lung function is only, I don't know, 17% of predicted, for example. And similarly, patients with very mild lung disease who experience great functional difficulties, feel like they can't leave the house, that they're unable to do a lot of things and require a lot of help. So there is this discrepancy between the objective or the biological body, as Merleau-Ponty called it, and the body as we experience it or as we live it. Now, when we think about the sensation of breathlessness, of course, it's not painful, but it does cause severe distress. And again, just close your eyes and think about what it would feel like if somebody put a pillow on your face and you would be struggling for breath, okay? The distress is tremendous. And especially, and I can't emphasize this enough, our understanding of the breathlessness experienced in end-of-life disease and end-of-life in, the last few, hours and days of somebody's life is still radically undertreated, radically misunderstood, and overwhelmingly ignored or taken as an inevitable part of the process of dying. So one very, very important thing palliative care professionals need to do is to control and support the breathlessness of people to alleviate the symptoms. And that can be done by low-dose opioids. It can be done with other medications that are like Valium, and so on. So breathlessness causes, again, severe distress, but because it's not pain, it often tends to be underplayed in clinical contexts. But again, from the neuroscience of breathlessness, we know that the same brain pathways are activated in pain and in breathlessness, also in experiences of hunger and thirst. So there is some commonality there, even though being breathless isn't painful per se. And when you ask people who experience breathlessness, they say it's a very overwhelming sensation. Now, of course, there's nothing to see when somebody is breathless. They're just standing or sitting or lying quietly. But the sensation is extremely overwhelming. And these are some of the articulations people have used about it, that talk about it as feeling trapped, feeling I'm about to die, suffocating, and so on. Okay, so I want to try and outline in the next, I'll try and wrap up in the next 10 minutes, some of the phonological features of that breathlessness. So again, if you take the, Heidegger to Merleau-Ponty to Iris, Marion Young kind of trajectory of thinking about possibilities, we take the Heideggerian notion of possibility that, of course, Merleau-Ponty takes as an embodied possibility. And then when that possibility is restricted, it is not just your physical possibility to run fast or, or do water sports or whatever that is restricted, but in fact, your entire world shrinks. It doesn't just shrink, it also becomes hostile. So one distinctive phonological feature of breathlessness is the way in which you experience the determination or limitation of possibilities happening because of the breathlessness. That shrinking of the world, going places becomes difficult, travel becomes difficult. You can't just decide to do something and then do it. You need to think about where you're going to park, how much oxygen are you taking with you, who's going to help you, how much shopping can you carry, how many stairs you will need to navigate, and so on. Everything becomes subject to this kind of meticulous calculation, which really restricts one's world. Now, the restriction is not just a restriction of, my physical ability to carry that much shopping or not, but it's also a restriction of one's choices and freedom of what one wants to do with their time and with their life. So projects, as the example I gave earlier of the post-dinner stroll, gave you the projects are delimited by a restriction. And chronic breathlessness is largely associated with poor mental health and with feelings of helplessness and fear, and of course, anxiety and depression that tend to affect quite a lot of people with chronic breathlessness. I would say that breathlessness relates to what I call bodily doubt, which is a sense of acquired hesitancy or uncertainty or distrust we have of our bodies that come after repeated experiences of failure. So if you're trying to, carry a lot of shopping and you've really outdone yourself and you find that you have to leave half of it and go and drop some off and then come back for the rest, that's not bodily doubt. But if you have a repeated experience of trying and failing to bring, one bottle of milk home, then that could lead you to a sense of bodily doubt, a sense of uncertainty and distrust of the body, and distrust of, again, bodily functions that we usually take for granted, that I'll be able to walk to the shop and back, that I'll be able to carry one item of shopping and so on. So the body loses transparency, daily activities become a problem, and our ability to be, our Sein können, turns into maybe not being as unable to be, but being less able to be, only partially able to be, being only sometimes able to be, and so on. So the famous, Searle and I can, becomes I no longer can, or I once could, but I no longer can. So what happens in such breathlessness is that the modulation of breathing becomes explicit. There's an artificial and a conscious engagement with breath, which can be very biological and mechanical. If you have a lot of these breathing tests that can lead you to think very mechanically about your breath. If you use oxygen, then there's lots of other kind of mechanical considerations. And that explicitness, thinking, is this too hard for me? Can I do this? Do I need help? Can I do this by myself? Becomes second nature. So again, this kind of sense of self-doubt and guessing is another aspect of the bodily doubt I described a minute ago. And what we end up with is what you might call the breathless habitual body, where you try to do something, you fail, your body censors that movement, says, I'm not going to try and, skip or jump or whatever. And that leads to new bodily habits. So breathlessness also, as I said, changes our relationship to the environment. A new terrain is created where freedom and obliviousness are replaced by hesitation and limitation. Distances seem further than they are, and the shared sense in which we all partake in these shared norms. When you say, "Oh, where's the nearest cafe?" and somebody says, "Oh, it's just around the corner," or "It's a 2-minute walk," people who are pathologically breathless are excluded from these shared norms, because for somebody healthy, it's 2 minutes. For the pathologically breathless person, it's 20 minutes or maybe not at all. Another aspect here is the disruption of intelligibility, where illness disrupts the meaning structures. Again, that taken for grantedness sense of normal breathing, of normal achievement, of normal capacity to carry out activities. And this can become acute at pivotal moments. For example, when there's disease progression and all of a sudden you think, oh, until a month ago, I was able to carry my shopping up this incline back to my house. And now all of a sudden I can't do that anymore. So that's a disruption of the meaning structure. There is a sense of bodily betrayal. And of course, the everyday norms that keep shifting as the disease progresses. So what we find in breathlessness is also a lot of mourning for the lost opportunities, for the relinquished activities, for the things I used to be able to do, but I can't anymore. And in chronic illness and in progressive illness in particular, there's a continuous reworking of the boundaries of the possible. So our bodily habits are reconfigured, and the body becomes increasingly a problem and an obstacle and a hostile stranger, if you like. So I will skip ahead a bit. Okay, to just wrap up, because I'll try and finish in the next 2 or 3 minutes. Going back to the social architecture of breathlessness. So again, there's an unshareability of that experience. It's not an easy experience to describe. We only have this one word, breathlessness, to capture both the healthy, exhilarated breathlessness you feel when you've just finished running a sprint or a marathon, and the breathlessness, the pathological breathlessness I was just describing earlier. There's unshareability, and it often undermines both healthcare and knowledge and understanding. There's a sense in which this pathological breathlessness remains very opaque, very invisible, because people become increasingly housebound, and also what's called in the literature refractory breathlessness. The breathlessness that is left, as it were, once the health professional has given everything they had or tried everything they had and nothing works. There'll still be this refractory breathlessness that, again, as I said, is a very, very powerful, not just a feature of end of life, but actually a predictor of end of life. So about a month before death, the vast majority of people, I think something about around the 80% mark, start experiencing marked increase in breathlessness. And that includes people who are ill with a respiratory disease, but also other people. So it's almost a precursor of one's declining health. And going back to what I said about stigma, When people are breathless, they often try and mask that breathlessness. So people often take out their phones and pretend they're taking a phone call so they can pause and catch their breath. They'll try to get to places on their own rather than with people, so their slow walk and their need to stop for rest isn't noticeable. And of course, often people who are breathless are trailed by all sorts of tacit assumptions or stereotypes of smoking, that they brought it on themselves, that they have something contagious. Of course, now with COVID, this is the primary expectation if somebody is breathless. And of course, the social architecture of breathlessness is very much premised on feelings of pity and terror, you know, the Aristotelian eleos and phobos, the components of you know, this response we have in the face of tragedy. And of course, denial. It won't happen to me. I'm never going to be that breathless. I feel so sorry for this person, that kind of thing. Okay, so to conclude, what happens in cases of pathological breathlessness is that life becomes a set of constraints. Now, this isn't to say that it's all bad, because in illness more generally, not just in breathlessness, but in illness more generally, there is an edifying impact. It's an opportunity to think about how you live, why you live as you do, what you want to do with the time remaining to you. It causes, I mean, this is another talk completely. I'd love to talk about the edifying impact of illness and of breathlessness. There's a sense of a need for encountering, authentically encountering one's own limitations in the most profound possible way. Now, this sense of being ill but well, of living well within one's constraints, is very poorly documented, both in medicine and outside it. But of course, one's well-being is impacted, one's resilience is depleted, and one has to tone down all of their activities. So, as I hope I've shown, breathlessness is a juncture of physiological, psychological, existential, spiritual, and cultural factors, all of which come together to create our thoughts, feelings, metaphors that we have around breathing and breathlessness. It cannot and it should not be studied solely as a medical or a clinical symptom. And as I hope I demonstrated, phenomenology gives us a useful framework with conceptual tools with which to understand breathlessness and to study it better. So thank you very much. Sorry if I've gone on for a bit too long. So yeah, some of the ideas in this talk were articulated in some of the Life of Breath publications. So you can go to the Life of Breath website, which still has an archive of some of our writings. There's some of them here. And then the top book, Illness, is the one in which I described my own phenomenology of breathlessness as it emerged when I was diagnosed with a lung condition quite a while ago now. And the bottom book, Phenomenology of Illness, is my attempt to give a comprehensive and systematic philosophical articulation of some of the things I discussed in this talk. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. We have lots of questions here. Perhaps you can come to the front. Sure. Just that everyone can hear as well. This is Jim. I'll move the camera as well to help. Yeah, you're visible on the screen.
Can you hear me, Javi?
Yeah, sure.
I'm a fan of your work, and thank you for coming. I'm so sorry that I can't meet you in person. I've got a critical question and then just an association. When you give the phenomenological features, it's almost diagnostic of breathlessness. I'm trying in my head to figure out the distinction between breathlessness and illness generally. What are the constituents of breathlessness that are unique, not just to illness generally? So that's a concern I have. And the other one is you got such a great field of resources with Merleau-Ponty on breathing. And I'm wondering why you haven't mined that amazing resource. So that's it. That's all I.
Okay, thanks. Is it
By
okay?
the way, I want to say something else personal.
Yeah.
I nursed my father to his dying day with lung disease. So I'm with you there. Okay, I know what that's all about. I just want to add that. But please.
Okay, thanks very much. I mean, Christos, it would really help if people said their name.
Morley.
Sorry, that was Jim Morley.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Jim. Thank you. Okay, so the difference is, okay, so I think in terms of breathlessness versus illness generally, I think the model of general illness, or well, the phenomenological model of characterizing general illness, and you could take Toombs, you could take Friedrich Svenius, you could take Matthew Radcliffe, you could take my work. I think there are they apply 100% to breathlessness. I think what you find in breathlessness that isn't maybe a part of a general illness experience is this very intimate connection to life itself. So as I said, what happens in our, if you think about illness culturally and the metaphors we associate with illness, I think it's the bodily function that is most intimately connected with life per se, with life itself. So when we talk about the baby's first breath or a man's dying breath, what we mean is the beginning of the life and the end of life. And I think that coupled with the very extreme, within seconds, threat to life when we obstruct breathing, I think that gives it a very special urgency and maybe some sort of elevated position within the hierarchy of illness. I don't know what you think.
So are you saying then that breathlessness is unique because it is emblematic of illness generally? And emblematic of illnesses?
More than that. It's emblematic of our very existence, of our very ability to live, I think.
Yeah.
In a way that diabetes isn't.
Yeah.
And again, I want to focus on this this end of life. What happens in the end of life? How people die. I mean, a lot of things happen, but one that is the most vivid to us as spectators, and I think also experientially to the person who is dying. And on a similar personal note to what you were saying, my father died of COVID in March this year, and I was with him. What people ultimately experience is themselves as being unable to breathe, and that's the thing that you also see as somebody who's there with them. What you witness is the diminishment and then cessation of breathing.
Yeah.
As I think the kind of the most existential marker of death, I guess.
Another comment, then I'll let other people speak. There are Tantric Yogic Pranayama practices where you develop the skill to be able to extend the exhale, in the exhale. And you willfully extend the exhale, just like the divers do. They practice this. And it is about approaching death and realizing your agni, your life. It's just a very interesting thing. In other words, there's a positive practice for breathlessness where there's actually insights, phenomenologically direct, intuitive insights that can be achieved through some of these practices. I just would love to direct your attention to that. You might be interested in that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would love a follow-up email exchange with you if that's okay.
That'd be great.
Yeah, because you said a few other things. There was the Merleau-Ponty.
Merleau-Ponty almost based his ontology on breath. Petri, of course, Pedersen writes about this, but his final ontology is essentially the chiasmatic interiority and exteriority of the exchange of the breath. Yeah. So there's a lot going on. You've got quite a phenomenon here.
Yes.
I'd love to talk about it. I share your interest.
Great, great. Thank you so much. So yeah, drop an email when you've got time.
Yeah, sorry you're not here. We could
I'm sorry too.
Okay, we have a few more questions from the audience over here, and then we'll move on to some of the questions that people are writing in. Crystal, would you? You had a question, right?
Me?
Yeah. No. Okay. So if you could just introduce yourself as well.
Am I on here? Oh, hi, Havi. Hayden Key, also
raise it up,
enthusiast of your work and interest in the topic as well. My question actually kind of follows up on James's question a little bit. And what I'm interested to know is with the distinction between normal and pathological breathing, as you've laid it out here, do you take that to completely map kind of the conceptual space of breathlessness? And yeah, I'm interested to know if there are properly some experiences described as positive experiences of breathlessness, whether that means because they're lacking the distress character that usually comes with pathological breathlessness, or even we could go so far as to say they have a positive hedonic value. And I'm thinking of, yeah, maybe the free divers are a great case. There are some other yogic experiences of breathlessness that I don't think are distressful or unpleasant. And you know, there are people who are interested in like asphyxiation. Is that because it's distressful and they find the distress pleasant? So just a kind of broader range of experiences. I'm wondering if you're interested in or have pursued those. And then kind of in the background there is I'm wondering if exploring those more might have some positive therapeutic value for people who do experience extreme distress in breathlessness. Could we help break the kind of negative feedback cycle that makes that disproportionately distressful by kind of re-educating with positive experiences of breathlessness? That sounds very pie in the sky, but just throw it out there because it's connected to my question.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. That's really rich. I mean, one of the things we wanted to do in the Life of Breath project that we never got to, we wanted to organize a conference called The Agony and the Ecstasy. And, you know, to just show that really so many of our practices involve tampering, interfering, controlling the breath in some way. So I think the agony I've talked about already. But the ecstasy, yes, there would be experiences like, what do you call it? Erotic asphyxiation. I'm not sure what it's called exactly, something like that, where, you know, it's related to something pleasurable. And also there's a whole class of people that we called aware breathers. Okay. So it'll be the free divers, of course, it'll be athletes, people who play brass instruments, or you know things like, you know, flutes and horns and so on, maybe some woodwind. Singers have a ridiculously developed notion. So one of the things people who are breathless are encouraged to do is to, if they can, join a choir, which up until COVID was all dandy, now is complicated, of course. And one of the things you do when you sing is you learn to pay so much attention to your breathing. So this leads to the kind of your question, the kind of about the amelioration. So the amelioration can certainly be done by giving people, empowering people to teach them ways to control their breath. For example, by taking, you know, vocal lessons of the sort that singers do all the time. You can hugely increase your control of your diaphragm, your sensitivity to what's happening in the different regions of, you know, the chest and the abdomen. And of course, what's happening in the throat and the larynx and the muscles and how much tension there is in your body when you're breathing. So I think there's a gold mine kind of practices and ideas that, of course, they have to be adapted very carefully. So pranayama breathing, for example, can be quite difficult, or some of it can be quite difficult for people who are who have a respiratory illness. But this is part of the kind of broader thinking to what I was saying of going beyond thinking of it as a medical symptom and saying, hey, here's all these cultural resources in sports and music, in spiritual practices that can all help. So far, at least in the UK, the thinking about breathlessness has been within healthcare has been pretty limited. And what people are sometimes offered is CBT to counter these negative thought processes I was describing. But of course, as you say, there's an explosive potential there. Next month, I'm going to a medical conference, and part of what I'm going to try and do is talk about these kinds of things and say, within the bigger context of what's called social prescribing in the UK, there should be much more social prescribing for breathless people to do things like sing or, you know, play the flute or whatever. So yeah, I think huge ameliorative potential, as you rightly say. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much.
If I could just add something to that, when you were talking about singing for breathless people, it just reminded me of, I have a couple of friends who stutter, and they actually find singing, when they sing, there's no stuttering whatsoever. It's something that has to do with how they breathe as well. Mm-hmm. So just thought I'd add that out of interest. Sure. But we have one question, if you can come down.
I think I can project from here.
Okay.
I have it slides on me. Just to carry on the trajectory of how maybe breathlessness or limitation can be taken into a positive, but not sort of trivializing breathlessness. But in context of high altitude, people who are limited because of age, like myself, so, you know, I'm not young anymore. So people who are younger just run up mountains while I have to crawl. Breathlessness really can, in fact, set the pace. And so it can turn into an advantage. And I think, well, I don't have any data to back this up, but medics in altitude clinics will tell you, will look at me and say, "Ah, don't worry, you won't have any problems. You're over 50, and the chances that you get high altitude sickness are much lower than these kids who will just run up, you know, and outspace themselves." And so that's one point I wanted to throw there. And another thing is about this, what you talked about, the conscious and unconscious monitoring of you know, our breathing. And something that might be of interest is the experience of, at high altitude, again, during sleep, one wakes up repeatedly breathless. So you'll be asleep, and it's like the brain forgets that you're at high altitude, and you forget to breathe, and suddenly you wake up and you're breathless. And you think, wait, why is this happening? It shouldn't be happening, because I was walking up and I could breathe. It was okay. But now, while I'm asleep and I'm completely at rest, my body has become breathless. So there's something going wrong between the mind and the body, basically. So I don't know, but it's just a comment. I don't know if you have anything to maybe add to that, but that's basically all I have to say.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, so about sleep is actually a deceptive one, because you think, well, in sleep, obviously, you're not exerting your body. Why would you need more oxygen? But in fact, sleep hypoxia is a big problem with people with respiratory conditions. And people sometimes need to use oxygen when they sleep, even before they have to use oxygen in the daytime for moving around and walking and doing things. And the reason is that when you sleep, first of all, you're lying down, so your diaphragm can't move very effectively. And secondly, your breathing becomes more shallow in sleep. So the gas exchange is poorer. And even healthy people desaturate a little bit. So if when you're awake, if you're healthy, your oxygen levels would be something like 98, 99% all of the time, even when you're exercising. During sleep, that can go down a little bit to 95, 96%, which is normal. So sleep is actually an activity in which you often require oxygen supplementation from a relatively early stage. So maybe that's part of what happens. I don't know anything about altitude breathing. But that's one thing. And then the other thing is, of course, what I was saying earlier about the cognitive contents of breathlessness. We have this thing called happy hypoxia, which is people who have very low oxygen blood levels, could be dangerously low. We saw that in COVID. people would turn up to hospital with ridiculously low levels of oxygen down to their 60s and 70s, but they didn't actually feel breathless. And then the people are in a high altitude, again, their oxygen levels can drop a lot. They can drop down to 85%, which is quite low, or even below that, but they're not feeling they're not feeling it as a limitation, if you like. And again, this goes back to what I was saying about the fact that it's an iterative process where you build on past experiences. And if you're a healthy, able-bodied mountain climber and your oxygen levels go down because you're in altitude, there's none of that negative baggage to make that breathlessness terrible for you. And that's one way of explaining why you can be very breathless, but not experience it as a negative thing in cases like altitude. And also, I hope explains, well, you need a respiratory physiologist really to give a proper explanation, but I think that explains what happens during sleep. And of course, one thing that happens in sleep is that if your oxygen levels drop, you will wake up. So this is something I think that you have in apnea, is that you get woken up dozens and dozens of times over the night. And I don't know if that happens if you're sleeping in high altitude before your body's acclimatized.
Thank you.
Okay. We have a question also from Odysseus Stone. I'll just read it out, but you can also look at it in the chat. It's one of the criticisms of mindfulness is that it involves navel gazing, quietism, etc. i.e., just focus on your breath, not the external social reality. What do you think the implications of highlighting the shared aspects of the breath you mentioned for this criticism of mindfulness?
Oh, wow. Thanks, Odysseus. Hi. I saw you earlier on the video. Wow. So you mean, should the politicization of breath also encompass the politicization of mindful breathing? Well, I think mindful breathing, it's kind of by definition political, because it goes against, it tries to resist the pressures of everyday life that we live with, all the horrible constraints of capitalism, productiveness, consumerism, and so on. So I think it is political in that sense. I also think that when people come together to create a community of breathers, I'm sure Petra will have a lot to say about that in his talk. Come together as a community of breathers, that's also political. It's also, I think, an act of resistance. But most importantly, I mean, from my point of view, I think the issue of air pollution is, again, one that we tend to ignore because of its invisibility, but ultimately, there's more and more data coming out now about the extreme damage of microparticles in the air that come out of, I think, from cars, from road traffic pollution. And that, we will pay dearly in terms of our life expectancy and our health, and even things like dementia that are now that people are starting to associate with air pollution. We and our children will pay dearly for this quietism. I like the mindfulness. I haven't come across this before, but yeah, Odysseus, I think it's I see what you mean. I mean, you can say the same about exercise. You see all these people jogging and going to the gym and doing things to look after themselves, when actually the problem is in the whole environment around them, that they're breathing filthy, polluted air. So, exercising when there's traffic jams, kind of, polluting the air all around you is in a sense, you're right, in a sense futile. I think it's of all the political causes, as it were, related to breathing and breathlessness, I think air pollution should be, or is actually the top priority. So thank you.
I've been given permission by the chair to jump in and respond to Odysseus. Odysseus, I'd like to put to rest this nonsense about mindfulness being nasal gazing. It's just ridiculous. The most powerful political movements in the world have been motivated by mindful thinking, by self-discipline. It's called nonviolent satyagraha, resistance, speaking truth to power. This is a mindful practice. It is a practice of discipline against power. All nonviolent resistance has been founded on these meditative principles, where you have to transform the violence within yourself first before you transform the violence out there in the world. This constant charge of mindfulness, yes, there's a lot of silly, petty nonsense going on there, but at its core, mindfulness has profound revolutionary potential. There is no nonviolent resistance without mindfulness. And nonviolent resistance has brought down the British Empire. Can bring down, it's endless, the list of powerful influences that mindful or meditative-based political practices have been profoundly effective. So I just want to put this to rest, or at least get this conversation heated up and get going on this.
I don't know, Odysseus, if you want to have a quick response to that. It looks like you're searching for the unmute button. Okay, it's a bit hard via text. All right, so on that revolutionary note then, we'll close for now and we'll return at 5:15. We'll just take a 25-minute break and return with Susie Farello and Petri Brenston just after the break. So see you in about 25 minutes.